So this one is kind of a loaded topic because the Monster Squad, unlike the other two films I've previously covered, is in no way, shape, or form an unknown movie. You may not have heard of it, but rest assured, it has a dedicated following. This is the definition of a cult classic. All right, this was a movie that came out in 1987, very little fanfare. It did practically nothing at the box office, and in most cases, that means that it's going to die a slow death and be regulated to the $1.99 bin. But through the magic of video rental, which I'm sorry, kids, you don't know anything about, but let me assure you, for all of its drawbacks, it was a pretty amazing thing. And constant cable TV reruns, this film amassed a dedicated following, passionate following. For kids, I say kids, for people my age in that early 40s, even the mid 40s going into their 50s, for a lot of people my age, the Monster Squad was a pivotal part of our childhood. It was that movie that kind of like a little bit like Transformers the movie, even though that one was aimed for kids. This was a movie that when watching it, you always felt like you were getting away with something. You know, it was darker than the live action Disney movies that were very big at the time. You know, and that was kind of the main source for young people entertainment, you know, Disney stuff. But it was darker than that by a long shot. It was darker than the Goonies, which we're going to talk about the Goonies a lot as it relates to this film. But it was not as gory or as objectionable as, say, the Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Child's Play movies, which were very big at the time. So you felt like this was a horror movie that was made for you. And for a kid like me, who was a huge fan, not just of Universal monsters, you know, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Creature, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, you know, all those great classics, but also a dedicated fan of real life monsters, you know, Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and UFOs and shit like that. This film just felt like it was made for you. It's had its detractors over the years. Most major critics just kind of write it off as a junky kids movie. At worst, it's called a Goonies knockoff, which is, I would say, not an inaccurate description, but I don't think it gives a complete picture of the film as a whole. But despite all of that, this film, to this day, remains a beloved classic for people of my age. And hopefully they're passing it on to their kids. I plan to pass it on to mine. And the question I want to talk about more so, we'll go over the basics here of this movie, of course. But what I really want to focus on when we look at this movie is, what is it about this film that has kept it in the thoughts and minds and hearts of a generation for this long? It can't be just the nostalgia factor. The nostalgia factor is a big one, I think. But I've seen other nostalgia properties fall apart upon re-examination. But Monster Squad, for me, doesn't do that. Monster Squad, for me, still has something more going on. It speaks to its audience in a way that not a lot of films did before, and not a lot of films have done since, and even in a way that the film it is most compared to, Goonies, didn't do. So I really want to take a look at Monster Squad as a nostalgia property and ask the question, why is this still so good? Why is this movie still beloved? So that's what we're kind of aiming at when we talk about the Monster Squad here today. So for those who don't know, for those who have never heard of this movie or have only heard of it in passing, let's talk about the movie itself first. So, through magical plot elements that are never really fully explained the how or why or whose it's, the classic universal monsters, and we're talking Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman, and the Gillman, that's the creature from the Black Lagoon for the uninitiated, wind up in modern day. By that I mean 1987, in the modern day, and Dracula is leading the monsters, and he's searching for a magical MacGuffin amulet that'll do something, and if he gets a hold of it, then the world will basically end, and the monsters and the forces of darkness will be able to rise up and destroy the world. Okay? The only people who are onto him, and the only people who have any clue that this is going on, is a small group of kids that are huge monster fans, and they're able to recognize the signs of people showing up. One thing, oh, Dudley, why must you always faceplant? One of the signs that the monsters are there is the leader of the monster squad, Sean, recognizes the age-old trick of Dracula spelling his name backwards to hide himself. He recognizes that. So it's this group of kids who are big monster fans, and they are the only ones that are aware that this is going on. And one of the things I like about this movie is they totally jump any part where the kids go, we should tell an adult, or they try to tell an adult and the adult pats them on their head. They basically acknowledge that nobody's going to believe them, and if anyone's going to stop this from happening, it has to be them. So this ragtag group of misfits, because it's an 80s kids movie, so of course they're a ragtag group of misfits, set out to do battle with, the monsters. So right away you can see the influence of classic horror comedy films in the concept here. The Little Rascals had a big part in the conception of this film, as did one of my all-time favorite films, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. The director and the guy who came up with the concept, Fred Decker, was a big fan of those films, on top of being a fan of the Universal films, and wanted to do kind of a modern take on that. A horror comedy that wasn't disrespectful to the films that it was, kind of making fun of, but wanted to honor their legacy and just tell them in a new way. And I think that goes a long way to talking about why this movie is a good movie. Let's start with that first. This is a good movie. It's still a good movie. It has some flaws, which we'll talk about here shortly. But on the whole, it is a really good movie. It is a solid film. There are just a lot of good choices. And I think one of the major choices from just about every aspect, that's the directing, the writing, the casting, the acting, is that it's very genuine. It is not there to poke fun at the creatures or the kids. Nothing in this film is taken lightly. It's all treated with a great deal of respect and reverence. How much respect and reverence, you may ask? Let me give you an example. In one of the very first scenes in Dracula's castle, we see, for just a second, scurrying across the background between caskets, 3 armadillos. Now, you may be asking, why is that significant? Because one of the most surreal scenes in the original Dracula, the Bela Lugosi classic, is for some reason there are armadillos running around in his castle. And nobody knows why there are armadillos in Transylvania. They're not, I don't believe they're native to the area. They're not even particularly scary. So why are they in Dracula's castle, and why do they take such pain to shoot them? So the fact that just for a second you see armadillos scurrying about in the background shows you the extreme love and the detail that the director and the writers want to capture. In terms of writing a movie for kids is very difficult, because you always run the risk of talking down to them. Kids can really tell when a movie is written by people who think this is how the young people talk. I'm not trying to, be mean here, but that's the problem I have with a lot of like 90s and early 2000 Disney stuff. Is it's definitely an old person's view of this is how those crazy kids behave. Monster Squad takes what Goonies did, because Goonies was one of those films that was written for kids and yet did not talk down to kids. It took that concept and went even further with it. This film feels, in terms of the dialogue and the point of view and the reactions, it feels like it was almost written by the kids. And I don't mean that in a bad way. The kids in this movie talk, for better or worse, and we're going to cover that here in a second. They talk like we did when we were that age. They talk like us. They behave like us. They react like us. The kids in this movie are real kids and with real kid reactions. Again, another great example of this. The leader of the Monster Squad, Sean, like he's the one who first discovers, Dracula, Alucard, that whole thing, and he's rallying the troops, trying to, okay, we're going to do this, 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 and he's giving his orders, and his little sister comes up and is trying to get his attention, and he's just ignoring her, and she bites him, and he immediately breaks this, I'm the leader, I'm in charge thing, and goes, ow, you bit me, I'm telling mom on you, like immediately goes to exactly what a kid would say in that situation. And I think because of that genuine feel, that realism, I think that's one of the reasons this movie really spoke to us, even in a way that Goonies didn't. The Goonies characters were drawn very broad. They're good characters, they're classic characters. Nobody is disputing or saying Goonies is a bad movie. Far from it. And I'm not saying the characters are bad. But they're broader drawn. They're drawn so that kids can immediately fill in the missing pieces with themselves and people they know. Monster Squad is a little bit more specific. The characters are very, very specific is the only word I can think of to use. It's one of the problems of doing this whole thing unscripted. But the characters are much narrower in focus, and as such, again, they come off almost as real kids. And I think that's one of the big strengths. All the kids in this movie are really good actors. Not a lot of them had experience up to that point. They had done a couple TV shows here and there, but in terms of a big Hollywood film, and they all carry themselves really well, and they work very well together. I think that's another thing that, people take that for granted in an adult film, getting a good ensemble. But it's really hard to do with young actors, and these kids gel together, and you believe them. You believe they are friends, which is something else that we're going to come back to here in a second, and one of the reasons why I think this film is as beloved and as remembered as it is. But if we're talking about acting, I think the acting MVPs for this, there's two people this has to go to. First of all, Duncan Rigger as Dracula. This is by far one of the best Draculas I've ever seen. I love Duncan Rigger's Dracula. And what's interesting is that he doesn't say a whole lot. A lot of it is just presence. How he moves and the looks that he gives, the way he fills out the costume. He just has this malevolent look. And some of the dialogue he does have is just fantastic, and he delivers it so well. Almost with the same air as a Bond villain. It almost looks like that's kind of how he's coming at it. Like, I'm not playing Dracula, I'm playing a Bond villain. And he feels very much in that aristocratic, pure evil kind of guy. And it's a delight to watch. It is a great heavy to kind of propel the action forward. But Tom Noonan as the Frankenstein monster steals the show. Which I almost hate saying, because if you look at any of the behind the scenes documentaries or interviews, he comes off as kind of a dick. So I don't know if he's a nice guy in real life or what. But I'm just saying, he kind of came off as a dick in some of those interviews. But damn, he does some amazing work in here. And again, with Frankenstein's monster especially, it's so much of it is physical and just reactionary. You know, the way he looks or the way he moves, the way he reacts to the kids. It's and what gets me is that he's not on screen all that much. It's actually not that meaty of a part. But what he does with the time he has on screen is quite amazing, really. And I'm going to say this, folks. I think I've said this in a number of reviews, and I'll say it again. I'm not a big crier at movies, or at least not at the movies that people think I should cry at. I did not cry during the first 15 minutes of Up. Sorry, baby, I didn't. I didn't cry when Andy gave away his toys. I really didn't care when Wally got crushed. You know, just, that's just me. I didn't care when the Titanic sank and Leonardo DiCaprio died. It just, none of that got to me. But you want to know one of the films that does get to me, and one of the scenes that does get to me? This movie. Yeah. At the very end, spoiler of course, you know, after when, you know, they win and all the evil forces are being sucked into this vortex, and Frankenstein is on his knees by the little girl Phoebe, who's only 5 years old, and, you know, their friendship had been kind of one of the linchpins of the film. And he's on his knees, and she's holding on to his finger with her both hands, and her hands are so tiny because she's only 5, and his hands are so big, and she's holding on to one of his fingers with both hands, crying, "Please don't go away, Frankenstein, please don't go." And he's saying, "Bye, Phoebe," you know, very, you know, E.T., you know, bye. And she's crying, reaching out for him, you know, "Don't go away, Frankenstein, don't go away." Folks, I'm telling you, I'm weeping like a Backstreet Boy taking a polo mallet to the nuts. I am not ashamed to admit it. I'm 41 years old, and I'm watching that movie, and that scene happens. I rewound it and watched it again so I could cry more. Like, it is a beautifully touching scene. And only done so because Tom Noonan did a great job as the Frankenstein monster, and the young girl playing Phoebe, she's not young anymore. She's, you know, in her 20s or 30s by now. You know, she is just a wonderful character and did a great job creating a character that was adorable but not annoying, that you actually felt for. And that's true of all the characters. So there's just a lot of good and enjoyable in this movie. And of course, it's famous for so many catchphrases from my childhood. You know, "Mummy came in my house," "Creature took my Twinkie," and of course, everybody knows the one that this is known for, "Wolfman's got nards." So is this movie perfect? No, it is not. And this movie was made in 1987, and unfortunately, some of the cracks in its armor are starting to show with age. For instance, right at the beginning of the film, I mentioned that one of the positives of this movie is that it feels like it was written by kids. The way they talk, the insults they hurl at one another, you know, butt munch and things. These are things we actually said, believe it or not. But that also extends to the things that we were not as educated about. You know, in the very beginning of the film, Sean and Pete, or not Pete, I can't remember the other kid's name, are in the principal's office, and they come out calling him a homo and saying, they send you to school, but they don't warn you about the homos. And it's like, ooh, dude. And shortly thereafter, the term faggot is thrown out, and you're just like, oh, wow. Not trying to defend anything, but saying we did toss those words around. And I can only speak for myself. I don't know about anybody else of my generation. Those terms back then I don't think most of us knew what they meant. I certainly didn't. I didn't know what a homo was, and I didn't know what the F word meant. What we knew is that they were words we weren't supposed to say, like shit or fuck or damn. So of course we said them, whispered to each other, in dark alleys or said behind the teachers, that kind of thing, like we were getting away with something. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, fortunately, we are more evolved now, and luckily that scene takes place at the very beginning of the movie, and it doesn't happen. They don't use those terms ever again. It's just right there, piled in the front. So you could zip right past them and not even worry about them. But it's one of those moments where you realize simultaneously how long ago 1987 was, and at the same time, how not that long ago 1987 was, if you catch my drift. But that happens at the beginning of the film. That's not kind of the most uncomfortable portion of this movie. Unfortunately, the times that we live in, some of the more famous stand-up and cheer moments of this film are a little tainted at this stage. Rudy making silver bullets in his junior high shop class at the time was meant to show a sign of his ingenuity. Okay, great. Takes on a little bit different meaning now, and especially one of the great lines of the film is after, of course, the quintessential fat kid, nicknamed cleverly Fat Kid, kills the creature from the Black Lagoon with a shotgun, and the two bullies who have been tormenting him throughout the film say, "Hey, Fat Kid, nice job." And he turns around and says, "My name is Horace Chuck Chuck." At the time, that was I don't think I'm overstating it. That was the "this is me" of my generation. Sad as that may seem, we were in the 80s, and we were very much in that might makes right kind of mentality, where if someone fucks with you, the only way they're not going to fuck with you is you stand up, be a man's man, and, show them that if they fuck with you, you're going to fuck with them worse. So it was a very big kind of, yeah, go Horace kind of moment. Sadly, the idea of a tormented kid getting back at his bullies by threatening them with a shotgun takes on a darker and much more sinister tone these days. I will admit it makes that moment very uncomfortable for me. So yeah, and probably just the sheer number of kids killing things and shooting people in this movie kind of adds to that. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of the movie. But what I want to take a little bit of time here at the end, and like I said, what I want to really explore is, why is this movie still so beloved? How did it generate this fan base? We've given some indications, good script, good directing, earnest acting and directing choices, but I don't think that really gives us a complete picture. A lot of that you could still enjoy for nostalgia, but I still think this movie clings to our psyches for much different reasons. I think there are two primary reasons why this film is still so beloved. And the first kind of comes to the general subject matter. Monsters, which of course most kids really enjoy. Most kids love monsters on some level. But I also think that as kids, and I don't think this is just my generation, I think this is every generation, every group of kids, they have this thing that they just fall in love with. And not just fall in love with, they take time to learn about, to memorize. A few generations back, I would wager most kids could tell you every kind of Pokemon that was out there, but couldn't tell you, most of the important things from history. And that's not a slam on them. It's just a statement of fact of being a kid. We tend to gravitate towards knowledge that we deem important in our youth, but obviously the parents and the adults in our lives who are trying to get us to concentrate on math and science and history, are about ready to tear everything up, because why won't you just put that away? It's make-believe kind of thing. I'm reminded of this Far Side comic where a kid is playing Nintendo and his parents are behind him. The caption says hopeful parents, and they're imagining like a help wanted page looking for someone who can, save the princess. Hey, can you play Super Mario? We'll pay you $25 an hour. Little did they know that eventually there would be professional gamers, but however, I digress. We all have that. We all have that thing that we have just dedicated a large chunk of our life to, and when you get down to it, it's fairly useless knowledge. But the power fantasy of this movie is so strong, and one of the things it latches onto is that knowledge that you have accumulated, that knowledge that everyone tells you is useless, that knowledge that gets you in trouble in school, that knowledge that keeps you from fully integrating into society. Well, that knowledge is actually what's going to save the world. Believe me, I would love it if my idiosyncratic knowledge of Power Rangers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the works of Jim Henson, Abbott and Costello, the Marx Brothers, Spider-Man, the X-Men, most comic books, really, professional wrestling. I would love it. 1940s movie serials, the forgotten films of Humphrey Bogart. I would absolutely love it if it turned out that somehow the combination of all of this knowledge was the way to cure the coronavirus and I could be a hero. Who wouldn't love that? So first of all, it's telling kids it's okay to like the things you like, that it gives you power, it makes you different. So I think that's part of it. But upon this rewatch, I came up with an even stronger theory. Why this movie has latched on as much as it has into the psyche of an entire generation. And once again, we have to compare it to the film it's most compared to, The Goonies. Yes, this film is in the same vein of The Goonies, but there is some very specific differences. Especially when you when you look at them as 80s movies. The Goonies, believe it or not, is the cool kid. They're the popular kid. They are the big budget, big director, bigger actors. They're the larger scale thing. They're the one everybody knows, everybody wants to see, everybody loves. They're the popular kid. The Monster Squad is the Monster Squad. Literally, the characters in the movie. It's the geek. It's the outsider. It's that little film you had to look for. It's that little movie that you had to trade videotapes to find, or that you had to sneak watching when it was on HBO. It spoke to a section of the audience. And again, if you look at it like from the concept of pop culture of the time, in high school movies of that time, compare those to like the high school movies of the 90s. In the high school movies of the 80s, there were two factions: popular kids and nerds. That was it. There were no other levels. You were popular or you weren't. Compare this to like the cliched parts in 90s movies where they're taking the new kid around the school and saying, over there are the goths, and over there are the theater kids, and over there are the stoners, and over there are the this. It wasn't until the 90s where it seemed like school culture and popular culture broke off into little subgroups. But it's not to say those subgroups weren't always there. And I think understanding that is the key to understanding the Monster Squad. The Monster Squad, their characters are outsiders. They don't belong anywhere but with each other. Especially when you look at the Monster Squad themselves and the characters that make up the team. You've got the three, Sean, I'm just gonna say Pete, even though I know that's the dog's name. I cannot remember the third kid's name. You've got Sean, Pete, and Fat Kid, who are all about the same age. You've got Rudy, who is in junior high, and yet is hanging out with, 12-year-olds. And not only is he hanging out with 12-year-olds, he's supposed to be the cool kid, but he is dressed like a 50s greaser. So right away, he's an anachronism. And you've got Eugene, who's a little kid. And there's no explanation as to why these junior high and 12-year-olds are hanging out with this much littler kid. There is no familia relationship. He's no one's brother. He's just there. And he's just one of the group. This is a group of kids that don't belong anywhere else. They have no other faction. Because when I first was thinking about reviewing this film, I was like, why does Rudy hang out with them? And really, it's because even though they don't go into it, and they never say it, he's an outsider. This movie was made for outsiders. This was a film before the Hot Topic came along. And, you could go to the goth store and, find everybody else with a Nightmare Before Christmas t-shirt and find out that they all love the same movie. This was before the days of the internet when, you can go online and find, if you love some obscure British show that only ran for 3 episodes, you can go online and find an entire fan base based around those 3 episodes. You can find other people who like the things you like. It wasn't that easy back then. You either had to pretend like you liked the things everybody else liked so that you could join the group, or you had to keep other things to yourself because no one else shared your love of it. I can tell you right now, my best friend and I, we became best friends. We first became best friends because we had a love of Abbott and Costello. Something no one else in our age group had even heard of. And I think when you understand that driving force, you understand why this movie has clung so hard in people's minds. It's a movie for outsiders. It's a movie about outsiders. And the fact that they're outsiders who save the world, I think that's part of it, the power fantasy. But I think more to the point, they're outsiders that create a family unit. That they're real friends. They have a real connection. They come together because of their mutual love of something esoteric. What kids their age in the 80s were big fans of 1940s monster movies? Okay, me, but so they came together over something esoteric and formed a real friendship, even despite the fact that they don't have much else in common, but it's that little thing that kept them all together. And I think that's why this movie works as a cult classic. This movie doesn't work as a big budget film. It doesn't work as a fireworks extravaganza. It only works as a cult classic, as a little film for people who discovered it and felt like they were the only ones who knew about it, and then found other people who loved it and felt like for the first time they found somebody who spoke the same language as them. I think that's why this movie still sticks with people. I think that's why people are very passionate about it. I think that's why it just still holds up. It's more than just nostalgia. It's a sense of belonging. And we know people still have problems with that now. Imagine how much harder that was back in the days before the internet. I still love this movie. It's still one of my favorite Halloween films. It's one of my favorite nostalgia trips. It's not without its flaws. It is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but when I watch it, I smile, I laugh, I cry. It's just an all-around good time. If you haven't watched it in a while, go check it out. And maybe if your kids are old enough and they're into that kind of thing, maybe introduce a new generation to the Monster Squad. I think the Monster Squad deserves some new audience. So, that's all for me. We went a little long with this one, but I had a lot to say. So, at any rate, thanks for listening to this entire rant. And as always, have a happy Halloween, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies. And never forget, Wolfman's got nards.